Welcome back. Good afternoon. This is Judy Kuszewski, the GSSB chair. In this final part of our meeting, we will be looking now at the GSSB work program for the forthcoming period. I'm going to turn it over to Bastian Buck to talk us through all of this. We have, this is item 3 in your, we have item 3, which is the stakeholder council recommendations to the GSSB as part of the discussion here today. But Bastian, I'm going to let you talk us through this.
Yes, thank you, Judy. So under the due process and the terms of reference of the GSSB, we have an obligation to issue a work program on a rolling basis for 3 years. And we are coming up now to a point that we have to renew the work program and look at the 2019 to 2021 timeframe. What I want to do in the discussion today is to walk you through considerations of what could feature in that work program based on discussions you've had, but also importantly decisions that are already taken. And also the resourcing realities of the standards division and the GSSB, so staffing and the ability to run X number of projects at a certain point in time. I should say at the outset that I think in the beginning of the activities of the GSSB, when we moved from the technical advisory committee to the new governance structure in the GSB, the work program was used to also communicate an ambition on what could be the overall mandate of the GSB and how the GSB could get involved in various activities, also beyond reviewing existing standards, creating new standards, and probably extending the offering of the core product. What the reality has been over the past 3 years is that we actually never really got to the point to entertain very many projects other than the review of standards and the creation of new standards. And the recommendation here from the Standards Division is to actually focus the work program going forward on those activities. And there are 2 reasons for it. One is we have received feedback from stakeholders that looked at the overall work program and said, clearly you're not anywhere near what you wanted to accomplish. And also with that, an indication that it's not very predictable in terms of when projects kick in and how the GSB operates to finish them within a certain timeline. We all know that this is first and foremost a resource-induced reality, but stakeholders stand to benefit from a clear articulation of what it is that we are planning to do in the next years. And I think there is always, on a yearly basis, the opportunity with more capacity, more resources, to review the work program and assume additional projects. That is not the problem, but from a standards division perspective, it is advisable to start with what's realistic right now, and then if we have the opportunity to scale, add to the work program on a yearly basis. And it's also important to note that the work program is for public consultation. So we actually are asked to put the work program for public consultation. And today I want to have a discussion with you about the building blocks of the work program we want to put out. And what we will do is we will write this up, share that with you for electronic approval review and electronic approval before we put this for public consultation. So let us start with what we're going to cover. I want to review the ongoing projects, and then we have pending projects, projects that resulted from already completed projects or projects underway, as well as projects that at some point the GSB intended to start and for resource constraints has not started yet. I also want to bring back discussions that we had on priority topics, so future review and or new standards projects that we discussed with you over the course of the last 2 years. and the component of the sector program scale-up, because that will influence our activities quite dramatically. Last but not least, there is the element of the SC recommendations, item 3, which we have acknowledged yesterday, and we will go also through these recommendations just to consolidate their input for your benefit. So when you look at already ongoing committed projects, we have tax and payments to governments underway. You had the update yesterday, and we are quite comfortable that we can close this project over the course of the year by Q4 this year. The aim is currently to present the final standard for approval in September at the in-person meeting, and then the launch would fall into the last quarter. For the waste disclosures, we currently anticipate to finalize this project and launch in Q1 2020. For the human rights disclosures and the universal standards, as communicated today in the timeline, is the Q3 and not the Q1 as it was shown on the slide yesterday. I had 2 members of my team getting slightly nervous yesterday, so that was my oversight. It is Q3 that we are anticipating to close this project. Also on the ongoing projects list are the 2 pilot projects that we've been discussing for the sector program, so oil and gas and agriculture. And as we have discussed, we are starting with oil and gas, and agriculture will kick in slightly later. We assume that we will be able to close both in 2020, with the first one, oil and gas, by mid-2020, June 2020. So this is what we are already committed to. I've also shared yesterday that with the current headcount, between 80 to 90% of the capacity goes actually into the implementation of these projects, next to, of course, certain administrative functions and everything. And without additional staffing kicking in, for 2019, we're more than well covered. I think we're operating really at the limit of capacity. And really the opportunity to look at new programming kicks in early 2020. And the discussion we are having today is about, is there a prioritization that we want to look at? Do you have any pointers for us? Which programmatic efforts we should probably focus on? And also, how do we want to engage stakeholders in that discussion? Because we can put the work program for discussion. Sorry. Are there any questions regarding the ongoing projects?
So, Bastian,
yes.
Just maybe for a little bit of clarity here. I mean, I think it's sort of fair to say, apart from the fact that we have kind of written project proposals for some of these, is it accurate to say that the agriculture sector standard, for example, had already started in Q1 of 2019?
Well, so we've hired the people, and in the background we've done a lot of the background research. We've prepared the proposals.
I see.
And,
okay.
And that's what I've rendered in here. Right. Officially, of course, you still have to approve the project scope, but in actual fact, we've been applying resources of the team to it.
Okay.
That's the rationale, and I should have mentioned that. Okay, pending projects. We have, as legacy, 4 elements here. One is a review of the economic category, and that was actually at the outset of the activities of the GSB after the transition to standards. We debated at the time that if there's one element, one pillar of the offering that needs a closer look and more structural review, then it is economic performance, market presence, and indirect economic impacts. And at the time, we didn't have the capacity to start this, and since then we have a project proposal, but no action related to it and no resource allocation. This is a sizable project. It is certainly comparable to what we are now doing with the universal standards, because it is about a more fundamental rethink of how to depict the economic performance and what is actually relevant out of the economic performance. I should also note that, of course, we are actually doing work in that space with the tax standard, but there's much more to it once you unpack what we have here there are different considerations. A second project that is out there and has been communicated also as a follow-on, it's resulting from the work on water and effluents and waste, is the spills and leaks standard. We believe at the Standards Division that this is a more confined project because it is a very focused exercise. There's a clear set of experts to be involved, and there's a lot of also practice that could inform a standard like this. But at the time it was decided to postpone this, and we prioritized other things for now. So this is still waiting for us. And more recently, in the papers that you received for this meeting, we looked at which of the contents that are currently in GRI 301 materials would actually fold in with the waste discussion. And there is a recommendation, and you approved this for public exposure of the project working group to subsume some of the contents that are currently covered in 301 into the waste standard. But there are often contents now in 301 that need a review. And we have this reality that projects that we run usually, because of the interconnectedness of issues, there are always knock-on effects, and that's what we're dealing with here. And that's also a nice intro to the last group of projects here, because it's really a group of projects. It's a review of the human rights topic-specific standards. We have yesterday already discussed with you what we propose to do in terms of understanding what the actual extent of that project is, but it is then also actually going into the different, if you decide that topic standards need to be reviewed for human rights, we would have to open them up individually. Some you could probably co-locate, and it's the same group of experts dealing with it, if you look at the labor-related issues, for example. But for others, you have expert audiences that need to be involved, and these are individual projects. So, question for you at this stage is, in which sequence should the pending projects be implemented? And do we want to give any kind of pointer at this stage, looking at the reality of what we're facing in terms of capacity, but also implementation of projects and how they flow? Our recommendation right now would be that we could look first at spills and leaks and materials, because these are contents that we would need to assume, need to address anyways, because they're not fully intact anymore after the two projects that we've run. And then as soon as a more structural capacity becomes available, and that's likely only after we've closed the discussions around the universal standards and the human rights recommendations, we move capacity to a review of the human rights specific topic standards, and then lastly the economic performance.
Discussion of this? Robin?
Yeah, I think that makes sense to prioritise the ones where you've otherwise got a new standard out there, and then you've got some, for argument's sake, some orphaned or legacy content that hasn't got a home anymore. But I just had a question about the economic performance suite. Are there any other projects like the alignment project with the corporate reporting dialogue that might have impacts for, or recommendations that affect how you might pursue that suite?
No, because I think, no, I would say specifically to this COD alignment, this won't impact this element, because I think what we're looking for is actually what's the contribution to the understanding of economic performance, market presence, indirect economic impacts of a GRI standard, while all the other standards that are under the CRD look at the financial materiality. And probably these, if there is space to come together, better alignment, these are probably contents that fall outside the remit of the GSSB to start with. There are definitely very many projects underway, in particular in the impact investment space. And there are a couple of references there, Iris, Gin, the IMP project, that play in this field. And they actually develop concepts around what of the economic performance of institutions is currently not captured in financial reporting or corporate reporting, but is of relevance for impact investors. And that could be an input to and these are probably stakeholders that play a role in these discussions. So it's a field that is developing.
There is the possibility that there is some impact of climate change resiliency and that influence that already sits in 201. So there may be, it's not huge, but there is potentially some overlap.
Anyone else want to come in on this? I mean, I think of the, I would support the proposal as far as sequencing these already kind of committed projects. I have the sense that it may be worth just including the economic related standards in the sort of wider review of the space and the kind of the comments that we're receiving from stakeholders as well, just to confirm what remains a priority, what about it remains a priority, and also to understand things like, as you already sort of previewed, Bastian, the fact that some of this is actually sort of potentially partially addressed in the tax-related. There may be some elements of it that just need a bit more spelling out at this point.
What we could do as part of the work program consultation is to invite feedback specifically from stakeholders on what they would like to see the GSB to do in this space. Because the reason that it is there was feedback from stakeholders that they said these contents are definitely no longer up to the debate that's happening in this space. And also, isn't it odd that some of the things we ask are just replicating financial reporting information without actually any consideration of what the value added is? So that was at the time reason for bringing it up, and we could consult on that specifically out of the 3 elements. The other 3 are 4 elements. The other 3 are probably more straightforward because they're just logical knock-on effects of activities that you've already approved. Okay, we take note of that and then we make that an action.
Michel.
Yes, a few comments. Certainly, all the GRI 200 sequence needs to be reviewed based on what is known today. And it's always has been a bit one of my frustrations with GRI is that GRI was based on the stakeholders' value model, but there is in fact nothing about value created for stakeholders in it currently. The closest was GRI 201, which, as you stated, is basically extract from financial reports, and that's all. So it probably needs in-depth review, including on the definition of value. About spills and leaks, it seems a bit restricted to me. And I'm wondering if there shouldn't be a standard which looks more broadly at accidents, emergency situations, crises, which would then be applicable to more industries than just industries that have spills and leaks.
I think for the last point, there is a project proposal that exists, but we could certainly look at reviewing this. For the work program, would you want to invite feedback on, or should we provide wording to frame it a bit more broadly when we put it on the work program to say that, because is it in the direction of emergency preparedness and that you're pointing, or?
Well, spills and leaks is typically for oil and gas industry, chemical industry or equivalent, so it's very restricted. But for all industries, I think there is a difference between impact you have from what I would call chronic operations, normal operations, and impacts that you have through unforecasted events. And unforecasted events may be a spill or a leak, may be an accident, may be a crisis situation, generally speaking. It will be, of course, different industry per industry. For chemicals, obviously, most of the impact will be linked to either spills or, let's say, a big accident in a plant, which is going to have different kind of impacts. But I thought that generally speaking, having standards that focus on what occurs outside of normal operations would be something nice. And this is why I'm saying spills and leaks, for me, it opens the doors. But a big media crisis could be something that is very damaging to the organization and to its stakeholders. And so I thought about, let's say, opening the box a bit more and making it into something that would relate to more industries than just spills and leaks. I can't tell you exactly what, but for me it should combine spills and leaks, it should combine accidents with the broader definitions of accidents, it should have something about emergency preparedness, and it may include crisis management.
For purposes of the work program, would it then be a suggestion that we frame up that the GSB will discuss the scope of a follow-up project, that spills and leaks will be part of it? We can make mention of the other issues, and we will have to go back to the project proposal that we've set out and review that anyways, and bring that to your approval, and then we can have that debate. And much like we did that now for sectors, that we actually move to a stage where we have approved projects with scope, so that they can kick in when we have the capacity. So that's a discussion that we would bring back to you probably at the September meeting to refine that scope. For the work program, we would discuss that there is a project that is following up or resulting from earlier projects. It includes spills and leaks, and the GSB will look at including these other things. And if stakeholders tune in on this and have suggestions for that's also a welcome input to the discussions we will have.
Just to rephrase it shortly, I see spills and leaks more like a disclosure than a topic.
Bastian, is it possible that the spills and leaks standard, or in whatever form it sort of ultimately is determined to take shape, actually takes place after the oil and gas sector standard work begins? I can see that it could very easily be done either way. You know, one could inform the other, but there'd be a certain flavor of information that would come out of having oil and gas sector being done first.
Yeah. So the reality of the resourcing is, if I go back just one slide, is the first time that we have availability of staff members to take on any other project will be in Q1 next year. This will be, if all goes to plan, with the sector program, probably where we will have put oil and gas out for public comment. So lots of the background research is done, and that could inform then discussions. And I think we could guarantee that we're not setting up a new project that is following a completely different avenue, and so that should be okay, I think. I think the other thing that I would say related to the pending projects, also in the work program, we will communicate that given current capacity, we will communicate in terms of timeline that one of those projects will likely kick in 2020, right? That's what we can commit to at this stage, given what we know. I think we have to avoid the impression that all four of them will kick in 2020. We know already now that this is probably unrealistic. Yeah. Then topics that we have discussed at prior meetings and that keep coming back to us. I think that's the other way of describing them, because they are all one way or the other legacy issues. Biodiversity, we have discussed. We've brought this to your attention in a very focused way, just in light of the discussions that are happening at the UN in the run-up to the 2020 summit, where this will be the major agenda item, I think, on the UN level for the next year. All agencies at the UN level, but very many other institutions in the space that are relevant, whether you look at IUCN and all the others, they are working towards that milestone. And it is programmatically something where it would be advisable to be adopting this agenda early and being part of it, as opposed to after the fact and after, well, late in 2020 or in 2021 start to develop contents in that space. That is also an issue that has been flagged consistently by stakeholders in all consultations since the G4 as something that where the current contents are outdated and it would actually benefit from more of an update going forward. The second issue was raised by a couple of the GSSB members repeatedly over the course of the last 2 years, as so for data privacy or privacy, depending on how you want to scope this, as a space where transparency is definitely part of the debate. There is no global standard. There are very many initiatives that drive this agenda, and it has not really resulted in disclosure as part of sustainability reporting, and it could be something where, much like we do this for text right now, we could innovate and bring more, a common language to the space and bring the right people together. The next one, customer health and safety, is also a knock-on effect, basically, from prior work from the occupational health and safety. It is not necessarily the same as we have with materials and spills and leaks. Here we could wait a little longer probably, but it is certainly a gap, and it is an inconsistency that we haven't addressed that aspect of health and safety in a structural way, and the experts have advised for us to look at it. Last but not least, disability, also an issue that has been raised consistently actually from the very early days of GIS, as to whether this deserves an individual topic-specific standard. Most recently, we discussed that actually at the in-person meeting in September, where we had feedback on the subject matter again. And so this has been around for quite some time. And the question now, given resources, is, should we feature all of these topics as part of the work program and as part of the ambition? Do we want to constrain ourselves, and maybe, given the fact that probably in the next 3 years we can only address 1 or 2 of those, only put 1 or 2 out? And importantly also, should we be inviting feedback from stakeholders at this stage for additional topics? Or given the resource constraints, we just concede to the fact that even if there are ideas, we won't be able to address them, so we're raising expectations. I think the last one is always a bit tricky, because you also want to signal that there is a mechanism by which stakeholders can suggest topics which you are considering, given resource constraints, given other programming decisions.
Kirsten.
I, of course, see advantages by putting it up as an option to suggest new topics. I'm a bit more questioning if that would have any significant effect, that individuals had or individual organizations would suggest a topic. I think it's more important to evaluate what comes up through the other processes we have. And as Michelle already has mentioned, the emergency preparedness is an obvious topic in that context. I would get very surprised if it wouldn't pop up through the oil and gas standard, and for sure it would pop up when we come to the mining and metals, if not before. And it's an obvious deficit in the current standards. We find it in different versions in the sector supplements, and they are not aligned.
Michel.
Yes, short comment here. Biodiversity, yes, we certainly see it as a rising topic. The difficulty is finding performance indicators beyond what is already existing. And I don't know of anybody which stands out, any organization which stands out with good indicators about impacts on biodiversity. Biodiversity in the supply chain is even more, really an issue very difficult to address for organizations. Privacy, data privacy, a bit like with the previous topic, I would expand that to security, generally speaking, which is also a rising topic. So it's not just security of data, it's security of operations also. Customer health and safety, no pressing demand, at least on our side. The existing standard is satisfying, I would say, and beyond that it's very specific per industry depending on what kind of impact they can have, and so it's going to be difficult to have a generic one. Disability, again, I don't know if that justifies a standard or not. There aren't that many indicators that you will find outside of what is the percentage of your workforce that is disabled and what are you doing for them. I don't know if you will be able to build a standard on that.
I might just be a little bit troublesome here and ask a question about these priority topics alongside the pending projects, which is the previous slide. It is quite clearly, very sensible for us to say, well, we've got these pending projects, and particularly, for example, the materials and the spills and leaks standards. These are things that are on the agenda by virtue of the fact that we messed around with a different standard and sort of created a situation where we had to clean up after our, forgive the pun, I mean, with spills and leaks there. But anyway, the question that I would have, I'll just do it by way of example. The biodiversity topic is one that we know is, well, notwithstanding the fact that it's a significant challenge, as Michel has just said, we know that the standard that we have is behind the times. We also know that there's a significant sort of this UN milestone next year, which, unless something really unexpected happens, that is a boat that we're going to miss. However, if we were to think in terms of, are we allowed to go back into our pending projects and reset some priorities based on what we think could be a better opportunity for us to have an impact that's useful? And I guess the question that I would have quite specifically would be, can reporters live with the current situation around spills and leaks and materials if we were to say, actually, we'd like to seize the opportunity around biodiversity? I'm not saying that that is precisely the thing that either we should do or that I'm offering for us to have that conversation, but what if we were to try to, rather than, it is very logical and very sensible for us to have set these pending projects and to prioritize them in a certain way. But sometimes the sort of logical rationale is not necessarily the most compelling reason to do one thing versus another thing. And I think I just want to kind of challenge that a little bit and to allow ourselves to say, as a board, actually, we've examined these for all the right reasons and for the opportunity that they present for the GRI standards to create the impact that we want them to create. And so we might sort of step away from the very sensible timeline and sequence of events that we would otherwise set. I just put it out there as a possibility.
And maybe to respond to it, and I should have been clearer earlier. So the only projects we've definitely committed to at this stage, and that we, of course, you can change everything here, but you have definitely the mandate to. But they're underway, right? And we've committed resources, and we're trying to implement them as per communicated timeline. But when it comes to the pending projects as well as the priority topics, the choice is with you, which ones out of this whole combination you would want to prioritize. And it could very well be, if you go back again to the program right now, early next year when we close tax and payments to governments and the waste disclosures, we will have capacity within the team to start new projects. We can, over the course of this year, maybe do some background work. I'm not certain that we can put project proposals in front of you, but we should be able to do that relatively quickly early next year. And we can start 2 projects. That's the reality of our current capacity, probably next year. And whether this is then any of the pending projects or a combination of one pending project and priority topics, that's your decision, and if we can undo some kind of priority already in the work program, I think that's also helpful for stakeholders because they can react then to that prioritization.
Evan and sorry, I'm not quite sure who was in there. I'll do Evan and then Gustavo.
Well, to Judy's point, to me, I think fixing breaks and gaps in existing standard has to take priority. I think that goes to the heart of the authenticity and trust of the standards and this sort of core product proposition that we've talked about for the last 2 days. I mean, if we erode trust in the existing guidance or the existing sector standards, then I think that it hurts our ability to develop for the future. So I know that that's sort of busy work. It's infrastructure, that it's not very sexy, but it's some things that we have to do, especially if there are identified problems with overlapping standards or old standards that are now out of date. So I would always err on the side of fixing those things first. But then to Michelle's point about the data privacy, I would resist the urge to expand it to security. I think it might broaden it too much, especially if you're talking about enterprise or physical security. But I do think, and biodiversity I know is important. I'm not saying it's not important because of what we face in terms of the planet, but data privacy is just coming up so much in business discussions everywhere in Europe and in the US. I think that it's could be part of the human rights discussion. I mean, a lot of times we're talking about the right to our digital selves and to own our identity. We're talking about government access to our property, which is essentially our digital self. So there's a part of this that is extremely timely. And I think you're right, GRI has the opportunity to sort of own the definition of performance standard in this space, or at least be an early advocate for some standards of performance here that a lot of people are not on board with, unless you just follow GDPR and put out the most basic kind of disclosure.
Yeah, only a question about the pending projects and the topics identified. In all cases, they are going to finish like items and disclosures, or could be, I don't know, leaks could be included in another topic like environmental compliance or disability inside human resource disclosures.
I think for the topics that we will have that debate about scope, and you can subsume certain things into these projects probably that would change what we just had the example of security and how far do you want to go. But generally speaking, these are standalone standards, and it's not the idea to integrate. The only exception I would make is for the review of the human rights topic-specific standards. There might be overlap between existing things where contents now are actually subsumed into the generic standards, and they will just cease to exist in where we are. And that leads to a certain level of consolidation. And that is probably where a bit of this will happen.
Kent.
I just have a question about materials. When we finish this waste standard, is that going to make the material standard look wildly different? I mean, is there going to be a lot of conflict, or can they kind of coexist for a while as is?
I think they can coexist for a while. In actual fact, there are elements that are now part of disclosures in 301 that move into the recommendations or guidance in the new proposed waste standard. So it's not fundamentally broken. It's different for spills and leaks, where we basically have an element that is right now doesn't have a home anymore. But I think here for materials, this is one that could wait a little longer without any What we would have to issue is a version of the material standard that clearly signals that certain elements have been subsumed into the other standard, and that's scalable, and I think also in terms of communication that wouldn't be very complex.
Kirsten.
It just strikes me that materials and spills and leakages, it doesn't seem to me to be very complicated standards to establish. So do we really need to plan for such a full process as we would for biodiversity or human rights, etc.? We have very much of the material there already. It shouldn't be that many changes related to those as far as I can immediately think about. So is it room for a more simplified process for such kind of standards?
So for the spills and leaks, I think that will also depend on the scope discussion we're having around that. But strictly speaking, for what we identified at the outset last year for spills and leaks, we would probably look at a process where maybe an in-person meeting is not needed. It could be a technical committee as opposed to a project working group. And it could be a faster process to produce an exposure draft than right now. You look at an 18 months time frame for the usual project, and we would probably be able to condense that first phase that brings us to an exposure draft for this specific project. We also have the benefit that one of our colleagues, Mia, has background in that industry. So these are considerations I think that would enable us to start a bit quicker here. But since we have the due process, you would still be looking at probably a year at least until you have something in the public domain. Yeah.
But anyway, it would require less resources from the standards department.
Yes.
Yeah. Good.
Okay. Enough on this one? Do you want to move on?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I will try to summarize in a moment what we then propose to you eventually. So the last batch of projects is one that we have to discuss in context of an ambition level that we want to communicate as part of the work program. We've set out with the sector program, and we have identified what we entitled the priority 1 sectors here. We are starting with 2 of them now. We have in the background textiles and apparels and mining also lined up, but there's chemicals, banking, automotive, construction materials, and electric utilities on the list. And to make a credible claim to that space, in our interpretation from a standards division perspective, we feel we need to be communicating that we will address at least X number and probably this number of sectors within the foreseeable future. And since we have a 3-year time horizon, can we communicate at this stage that we aim to have this completed by 2021? Well, that's probably tricky at this stage without having any visibility into the budget reality for 2020. But the communication around we will take these projects on within the time frame that is now covered by the work program, so 2019 to 2021, based on budget availability and capacity, we would advise to do that, because otherwise we end up in a situation where publicly we communicate, we run 2 pilots, and then we'll see. We're not quite sure how to scale this. And I think this will, if we manage to run the pilots in the right way and we develop a model that we can scale this will have to have our attention going forward. So it's not so much a discussion whether the right sectors are in there. There's also opportunity, I think, to revisit based on what we learn and discussions like we had yesterday, oil, gas, and coal, and these kind of things, to refine that going forward. It is more, do we want to right now communicate as part of the work program that the GSB is committing to open more projects and run more projects in this space within the time frame that we're defining with the work program.
So what would be in what form of words would that answer the question that's here, Bastian, with the question being, what is the ambition level the GSSB should be communicating in terms of addressing this?
I think you can be very conservative about this and say we have identified the following priority one sectors. Once budget becomes available and is allocated, we will look into starting this, right? Or you can actually say the ambition is to run these projects within the time frame. And I think there is a spectrum. Just communication-wise, I think we need to make sure that the sector program is not perceived as a bit of well, there's some pilot testing going on and then we'll see. I think we're committed to do more of that already at this stage. And I think we can then look at the wording in more detail.
Well, it would seem to me that you know, what we need to convey at the moment is well, a realistic ambition as far as what we will be able to do within the current, you know, the 2-year time frame that we're looking at here. In the sense that, you know, it's absolutely perfect and quite reasonable for us to say these are our priority 1 sectors, and we seek to complete all of them at some point. In that 2-year time frame, we currently see capacity in place to be able to do X number of them. And the resources question has to do with how quickly we can scale up the capacity in the standards division to be able to add to that.
And just in terms of reality, if you assume that the colleagues that are now in the sector program are the ones that implement this, and if you keep capacity unchanged, what we can commit to at this stage is to run 4 of these projects, while in actual fact, probably the ones that we start next year, we are not going to complete in the indicated time frame, right? Because we're not completing them by the end of 2021, given what we know about timelines right now. That might change, but to be on the very conservative side, you would look at the first 4 on this list as realistic, given current capacity.
And I think furthermore, to be realistic and quite transparent with the stakeholders who'd be interested in this, there isn't a scenario in which a large chunk of money gets dropped in our laps, you know, in the next 2 months, right? I mean, if there's and you require a long lead time in order to do the expansion of capacity and putting in place the processes that would allow us to even start these projects. And if we're only talking, and here we are a quarter of the way through 2019 already. So I mean, I think it is just realistic to say that what we'd be looking at doing is a certain kind of a lead time in order to begin to take on additional sectors within this period of time, knowing that we will not be able to conclude them within this period of time. Right? Yeah.
We can definitely look at this and we make a proposal for wording there.
Okay. Discussion of this. Anyone have any specific questions or views on? Am I seeing you reaching, Kent? Yes.
Well, are we going to come up with a specific priority? I mean, both on these and the ones that we were talking about before. Because when you say you're going to do some, you kind of know which 4 you're going to do in this sector.
Well,
right?
so for the sector, our proposal would be to focus on those that have already been in the public domain. So the first 4 on this slide: oil and gas and coal, agriculture, textiles and apparel and mining for now. And these are the ones which we can probably commit to in terms of at least starting all of them and probably completing 2 in the time period. When it comes to the other 2, the pending projects and the priority topics, I think this is where, I mean, we have different opinions about that, but maybe the way forward is actually to, and that's also from a stakeholder perspective, probably an interesting combination, is to say we strive to start in 2020 one of these priority topics and one of the legacy issues that we have. Acknowledging, for example, if you go to, if we say we look at the spills and leaks, acknowledging that materials is maybe not fundamentally broken and it can be sustained for a little longer. And economic performance and review of human rights topics, we will learn more over the course of the universal standards and implementation of the technical committee recommendations on how we exactly scale this. And the economic is probably the one that will have to wait at this stage. And then I think what would be interesting in terms of guidance from you now is which ones on the list here. Is it biodiversity? Is it privacy? That we should identify as a priority for starting next year. I think that would be helpful.
Well, Bastian, back on that last slide, then it's human rights seems to come to the top on that last slide, because aren't we in the middle of it? I mean, it needs to go on. Is that right? I don't see how we stop on the human rights at this point.
I think, so yes and no. I think what we're creating with the current work on human rights is certainly the need to look at this, yes. But on the other hand, we will only go for public comment towards the end of this year with those contents. So I think stakeholders first need to deal with an understanding of what has changed or what's about to change in the standards vis-a-vis human rights. And then you can start to engage them on changing the topic-specific standards. So there's a bit more time. It certainly falls to the time frame 2019 till the end of 2021 that we have to start this, yes.
Whereas, for instance, I think we're coming to the same conclusion. Economic performance, it may be important, but it's kind of a discrete topic on its own, and we can kind of set that somewhere else in the time frame.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I think so. If I had to now paraphrase the discussion we had, we would probably drop materials from the immediate priorities list here. We will keep that as a legacy issue, but spills and leaks is something to be looked at with an extension of the scope. The second one is then the human rights topic-specific standards on this list. But on the other list, still, do we want to prioritize within the four that we have? I think we already agreed that we can invite probably more feedback in general, but I think it would be helpful if people could react to an either or. Is it biodiversity? Is it other opinions?
Go ahead.
I was going to put you on the spot, Bastian. So which of the four is it?
Okay. So I think when you think about it from a perspective of future-proofing the standards against the rising norms in the international arena and anticipating subject matters that will rise to much more importance in the UN scheme of things, then probably between the two, I would say I would lean right now towards biodiversity. Having said that, the second one, I fully acknowledge that this is a reoccurring subject. Very many come back to us about this in conversation. It is part of a regulatory debate, much like tax, right? And clearly there is a lot of effort in that space to sort out what's the normative expectation, but when it comes to transparency requirements and expectation, there's actually not very much happening. And in particular, I think the reporting organizations that advance more in this area, they look at GRI because they know it's not coming from another institution likely. So that's the demand. And an ideal scenario, so my answer is a bit twofold. I think in an ideal scenario, we would take on both next year. And actually next year for both is also very late. I think ideally we would take it on this year. Yeah.
But at least with this sort of surge from the UN with biodiversity, you're right that we don't catch it right at the top of the wave maybe, but we're sort of in the time frame that's appropriate.
Yeah.
Is it?
And of course, the reporters are welcome to use reporting tools and measurements and frameworks additionally, on top of what's in the GRI standards, and to the extent that these may be coming through with respect to biodiversity in the near future, it might not be that difficult for reporters to actually do a reasonable job on that issue. before before the GSSB and the standards division is able to get to that topic. Whereas I was going to make the very same point about the data privacy issue, that it is more like the tax and payments to governments, where there is not already in existence a set of international norms or standards or frameworks that we can readily consolidate from. This would be a matter of innovation on the part of GRI, and that in itself is a worthy consideration. Anyone else on this issue? Yeah, Corley.
Just a question around potential extension of the scope of the spills and leaks. I mean, the one thing that occurs to me is that if you look at accidents and emergency responses, it kind of spans environmental issues. So in looking at that, one would have to consider what the potential is for that to have knock-on effects on touching other things. So I think that is a real consideration in considering whether to expand the scope.
And I think the other reality for elements, if you confine it really to spills and leaks, the sector program will give rise to the need for dealing with emergency preparedness and these kind of things as well. So that will come back to us through that other channel eventually as well. Yeah. So that's also a discussion. I mean, for biodiversity, and probably another way of dealing with it could also be, this is a consultation at this stage, and to put it out and actually ask stakeholders. And you have, and I was planning to mention that later, you have already agreed also at the last year's in-person meeting in September, a list of organizations that we should engage on our programs. And maybe, because there's a number of the UN agencies, as the OECD and others, that we said we would contact and reach out to on this. Maybe their feedback actually could then inform the decision between the two if we have to make a judgment call because of capacity. Mm-hmm. But I think the signal could be now, both of these issues you deem important enough to take them on at this stage, that we're consulting stakeholders on it as part of the work program public consultation, and then in September we will have to settle. We don't have to decide that earlier because, quite frankly, there's, other than a bit of preparatory work, there's no capacity in the team to really deal with the substance of this at this stage. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
I'd like to also, I mean, in the same exercise, I'd like to engage the Stakeholder Council recommendations and in fact, in the interim, go back to the Stakeholder Council with not just a sort of initial response to the proposals that they've made to us in this item number 3, but also to ensure that they understand the wider context around the work plan as it currently exists and as the next phases of it could be developed, depending on the availability of resources and the judgment of this group as to the priorities. But maybe that's a good time for us then to go on to this next bit where we are looking at item 3.
Yeah, and I think this is part again. I think of our interaction with the SC. This was not prompted by the GSSB. These are recommendations that were initially provided to the GRI board. The GRI board has delegated them where there is, this falls more into the domain of the GSSB. There are 4 recommendations here. 2 relate to the TCFD, 1 to financial services sectors, and 1 to green, social, and sustainability bond standards. Just to tackle them one by one, for the financial services sector-based standards, the recommendation of the SC is to look at the existing contents for financial services sector and look at ways of updating those. Much in light of the discussions we had also yesterday, we have historically built up contents that have led to industries adopting GI, and we need to prioritize those. When you go back to the priority 1 sectors, there is an element of this. It's not fully resembling what we have covered under financial service right now, but the banking element is in the priority 1 sectors. And our recommendation from the standards division would be to go back on this specific point explaining this, pointing them to the work program and say that indeed part of that discussion will be subsumed into our programmatic focus for the first years of the sector program. For any questions on that?
Well, yes, let's definitely do that, and sort of go back and explain the positioning of banking within the priority 1 sectors. But there may also be an opportunity for us to engage a little bit more about just banking, or why just banking and why not financial services more broadly. Is there a way for us to at least sort of meet them halfway, or to understand the specific ambitions that the Stakeholder Council may have in mind, and the way that we may or may not be able to achieve those, just given the work program as we've currently defined it versus adding to it?
Yep. Okay. Then for the 5th and 6th recommendation to the SC, related to the TCFD, I think there are 2 different points. One is to look at how GRI reporters are already prepared to respond to expectations raised by the TCFD, and the second one is then more technically actually demonstrate the alignment. And while we haven't spent a great deal of time on that subject matter, what we did mention yesterday, as part of the CRD alignment project, we are actually looking at the TCFD recommendations, and we're mapping the GRI standards against those. So a natural outcome of this will also be what we have discussed last year, a positioning paper on how the GRI standards actually relate to the TCFD. Not under the CRD umbrella necessarily, but we could definitely aspire to consolidate our learnings from that project, specifically under the GRI branding. That's certainly in the cards, and that would be the response here. I think the other thing is also probably to acknowledge that the GSB is aware of the importance of that discussion, that we had the TCFD contributing to a meeting last year on invitation of the GSSB, and it's merely a function of resourcing that has delayed the implementation of that. I think that's also an important signal. I don't think that this is something that we've ignored in any way. Then, any questions related to that? No? Then the last one is related to green, social, or sustainability bond standards, and there are very many of those. As I've shared, I'm also currently overseeing our activities related to capital markets in a small team that is active in that space. We haven't structurally engaged in that debate. And currently we also don't have capacity to do that. It's a very wide field. Interestingly enough, very many of these initiatives, one way or the other, circle back to GRI, and they try to build on things that already exist. There is an opportunity here that we can certainly acknowledge, but it also falls outside mostly the GSB space. So when we go back here, I think that is maybe where we could consider to look at this more is on a technical level, to provide advice to those that inquire with us, but to structurally build this out as a programming issue right now, this is simply not inside. And if there was capacity available, given all the other priorities we have, probably it would move directionally into other fields of work that we have. Yeah.
And if the Stakeholder Council had a sort of fuller understanding of the rest of what we've been discussing in this session, we might be able to go back to them and ask them, well, where would you slot some of these things in the context of what we've already committed to doing, the already identified priorities, the sector program, etc., and with what rationale? So I mean, if we can sort of engage with it at a slightly more detailed level of, sort of understanding what's behind the recommendations, then I think it might be a bit more satisfying for us to do that. But I think we could probably actually go back to them with some good, nuanced context in the short term, so that we can prompt that dialogue later on this year, I hope.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, Kent.
I think it's important to go back and say no sometimes. I mean, that's the whole issue, right? We have a restrictive financial, we're restricted in what we can do, and it's got to be seen in the rest of the organization, right? Yeah.
And not to preempt any actual discussion of it, but I would see the kind of green, social, and sustainability bond standard intervention in that sort of a light. It's kind of, we hear you, and we respect that, but we can't prioritize it right now because we have other things that rise to a higher level of priority for us. Any kind of, does anyone have any thoughts or further views on these 4 proposed areas that came from the Stakeholder Council? Yeah, Evan.
Well, just in terms of being constructive with our feedback, I think that the green bond piece is pretty far afield, even if we were flush with resources. I'm not so sure it's something that we would take on in this body, and there are others who are doing this work. I think working in consultation with those standard setters and the Climate Bond Initiative and those people, if they're open to it, I mean, I think that we can influence the development of emerging standards without having to be necessarily the standard setter in this particular space.
Maybe just to acknowledge the fact that these recommendations were actually produced by the Stakeholder Council during their in-person meeting in October last year, which the Stakeholder Council chair then presented as part of her general update and recommendations to the GRI board. We're trying to shorten the times and improve the kind of clarity of communication such that we can respond more in a more timely fashion to these things in the future. The fact is that it sort of went, first of all, to the board, and we didn't have the right sort of process to ensure that it was put into a format that it could come to us and that we could consider it in the public domain, right? So hopefully these timelines will be a lot shorter in the future. And also, as discussed earlier today, these will come to us with what we hope will be a kind of better, more transparent understanding of what we will be asking from our fellow governance bodies in terms of their review and their feedback according to the due process, and also a wider understanding of what else is on our work plan. So.
Yes, in terms of next steps, and interestingly enough, I forgot to outline the action to respond to the SC, so that is definitely an action. We will respond to this. But what we're proposing, based on the discussions we had today, we will draft a work program for 2019 up to including 2021. And we share that for commentary from your side, but also eventually electronic approval. We will publish that somewhere in May, and probably for 2 months for public consultation. We will also look at the outreach that we have agreed last year with you in terms of the priority organizations, and we'll formally inform them about the opportunity to contribute to the public consultation, but where possible also merge that with existing conversations that we have with them to solicit their feedback. We aim to have then the feedback of stakeholders and also a final work program for you ready in September for approval. That's realistically the first moment that we can do that, with a meeting in June and then the next one being in September. And in parallel to this, Judy and I are informed by the discussion today and then the emerging work program. We will start the budget request discussion with the GRI board and the secretariat, because I think it gives us a good basis for signaling what we can do with the current resources and what beyond that would have to become available to be more responsive and probably also faster in terms of adopting more projects. So that's the outline for what's going to come between now and the September meeting. Any questions?
Does that bring us then on to any other business? Maybe a few minutes to summarize the day 2 discussions. I mean, obviously the discussion this morning was really largely around, in fact, almost entirely around the Universal Standards project. I think across not just the Universal Standards project, but some of these other projects that we discussed yesterday, the sector program, the Human Rights Technical Committee outputs, and so forth, there's quite a lot of direction, I think, that I hope we've been able to provide to the Standards Division around where to go with some of these in the future, and the information that we will be looking for to provide more guidance and to make some decisions in the coming meetings. Is it possible, Bastian, at this stage to sort of indicate what we might specifically be talking about at the June meeting? I don't know if it is. I put you on the spot briefly.
No,
but
well, yes, yeah. I think we will have to sort through our priorities there. But I think for the universal standards, we will come back with an analysis of the scope. We will put items for probably decision already in terms of limiting the scope or giving direction on where we are headed over the summer months. For the sector program, we will have actually advanced first write-ups of the oil and gas related contents, and hopefully we can use the June meeting also to solicit feedback on that specifically from all of you. In terms of outlook, then for and other projects, we will certainly update you on tax and payments to governments. We should have had our in-person meeting with the technical committee by then, and we should be able to indicate a timeline by when we can close the project. For waste, we can provide an update on the status of the public consultation. It's unlikely that it will have closed at this stage. We are planning right now to let it run into July. But certainly there is an update moment also for all the activities that we're planning. And I think lastly, the catching up on the work program discussion, I think that would be an element in preparation of the September meeting. To what extent we were able to engage stakeholders, that will be another item. I'm looking at the team. I think this is pretty much. Yeah, so that's part of the sector program update probably, right? Yeah. It could be. Yeah.
Well, there was an electronic vote proposed.
For the approval of the membership, yeah. So and that's something. Yeah, no, that's correct. So let me restate that. So we're bringing a slate for the project working group forward to you for the oil and gas, and hopefully that can be done before the June meeting, right?
It is. That's why it's proposed as an electronic vote, isn't it? Because it is to be done before the June meeting. Is that not the case? Yes. Can you remind us of the timing that we're anticipating for that?
I think it's April, but I don't.
That's what I thought so too. Yes.
We were trying to combine it with your review of the survey for Universal, so we were asking for it by the 19th of April, so that you had one clear deadline in mind.
But this is not this. Sorry. So that's the agriculture project proposal. So for the slate of the working, we will work well into late May, if not June, to have them all confirmed. So I'm. If we can, we'll produce it in early June. Otherwise, we'll have to approve it at the June meeting. Yeah.
Okay. My only sort of agenda behind doing that is just to make sure that it's on everybody's. It's in your mind that we will have some responsibilities to discharge electronically between now and the June meeting, and if you can be alert to that and flag early on if you have a need for any kind of discussion, whether in real time or virtual or whatever.
So maybe then on the electronic vote, as an action, what we will take is we will try to combine as many of the things as possible, so feedback on work program, survey, and so on. And we will provide, going out of this meeting, an indication for you when things will be coming to you. I think we need a week's time for that, probably, but next week we should be able to give an indication when you can expect contents for review, and also when we would want to schedule an electronic vote. We will consolidate that based on the discussions of the last 2 days.
Great.
Yep.
Yes, Kent.
One thing that was really helpful coming into this meeting, it shouldn't be because we should all be super organized, but Laura did a good job of reminding people about things that we ought to be responding to. And it was really helpful to me because you kind of, otherwise you can sort of go about your daily life, and then, she'd send out an email and go, yes, that's right, I've got to respond to that thing. So I just want to say thank you. It's not a bad idea to sort of jolt people out of their day-to-day life to sort of focus on these things.
Okay, does anybody have any thoughts that they want to share, or things that we haven't addressed that you wanted to, or indeed anything that's arisen through the discussion today that you'd like to talk about further? Okay. All right. Well, if that's the case, then I think we can close the meeting a bit early, and thank all of you for your time over the last 2 days. Very especially thank the Secretariat and the Standards Division for all of their everything that they've provided, from the logistics to the content, to the reminder emails, to all of the work that you've taken away that you'll need to be getting on with in the days and weeks to come. Thank you very much for all of that. Thank you also to Nolan, the sound guy, the audio tech, who's responsible for recording and making these meetings accessible externally. I look forward to speaking with you all again in the weeks to come. Thank you very much.